For those new to learning the ukulele, and also for the more experienced player too, there are certain chords that people will find harder to fret than others. This is completely normal, as we're often asking our fretting hand to form shapes and positions that we've never had to do so before. This video will be part of a small series of ukulele chord tips for beginners, focusing on several of these chords and offering suggestions, options and tips to hopefully make them easier to master. For this video we'll be taking a detailed look at one of these chords we have to learn that I find people understandably struggle with a lot, the E or E major chord. The E chord shape shown in the diagram is the one we probably see most commonly in chord diagrams on song sheets, etc. In this video we'll be looking at a couple of ways of playing this shape and also several other fretting options for the E major chord. The chord shape we're actually playing here for E is a D major shape, as per the diagram, but in order to play the shape as an E major chord, we would instead use fingers 2, 3 and 4 to fret the shape, and then move the whole shape up 2 frets, and we would add our first finger to the second fret of the string nearest the floor that was an open A string in the D chord, thus maintaining the same chord shape as a D but 2 frets further up the fretboard. We have E major. So it would be a good exercise to practice playing your D shape using fingers 2, 3 and 4 and then moving back and forth between a D and an E chord. Like so. Another thing to consider here is your thumb position. I tend to play the chord like this, with my thumb at the back of the neck of the ukulele, like so, which I find helps me get a little more pressure behind the chord. But often I see people playing E with their thumb up above the fretboard, like so, like many people would with open chords like C, G, F, etc. Neither is wrong or right, so experiment with both options. And if you are playing with your thumb behind the back of the neck, also experiment as to the angle of your thumb behind the chord to find what's most comfortable for you. You may also find that it's easy to get the 3 fingers in line to fret the chord by rotating your wrist slightly. Or even pushing your elbow out and away from your body in order to let the 3 fingers line up vertically. So you can see here, if I hold my hand relaxed in a normal position, my 3 fingers are diagonal, but if I rotate my wrist or push my elbow out, the fingers tend to line up a bit more vertically. So again, experiment with your hand position and find what's most comfortable. As with learning any new chord, it's good to pick the individual strings of the ukulele one at a time whilst holding the chord down in order to hear if any strings are not sounding correctly. If you are hearing any muted strings, do a visual check to see what may not be right with any of your fretting, and make adjustments until you get a clean tone from all 4 strings. Personally, I struggle quite a bit to fit my 3 fingers in a line at the 4th fret of my ukulele. I have quite large hands and I play a soprano-sized ukulele. So I tend to bar the 3 strings with my ring finger. This can also be quite tricky, as you need to be able to fret the 3 strings nearest your face at the 4th fret without touching the string nearest the floor, which is left to be fretted with the 1st finger at the 2nd fret. Some people are able to collapse their barring finger at the joint of the 1st knuckle, like so, thus making this a bit easier to do. This is also a common technique on guitar. As well as barring the 3 strings nearest my face with my 3rd finger at the 4th fret, I also tend to bar all 4 strings at the 2nd fret with my 1st finger, like so. The only string that really needs to be fretted at the 2nd fret is the 1st string, the one nearest the floor, as all the other strings are cancelled out by the 3rd finger. But my hand feels more comfortable and relaxed with both fingers 1 and 3 barring, instead of my 1st finger just fretting the 1st string at the 2nd fret. Everyone's hand anatomy is slightly different, so experiment with both options and see which works best for you. It will probably take you some time before fretting this chord becomes more comfortable and starts to sound good, but persevere and eventually it will start to sound better the more you play it. The E chord, and in fact all major chords where there is no number after the chord name, is what is known as a triad. In other words, a chord with 3 notes in it. The notes in the E chord are E, G sharp and B. In this E shape we have the E note on the 3rd string from the floor, a G sharp on the 2nd string from the floor, and the same B note on both of the outside strings. Because there are only 3 notes in the chords and we have 4 strings on our ukulele, one of the notes of the chords has to be duplicated on 2 strings so that we can sound all 4 strings when we strum the chord. Another, and personally I think a much easier shape for the E chord, is this one. This E major chord is actually our trusty C major shape, probably the first chord you learnt, but the shape has been moved up the fretboard by 4 frets, maintaining the shape. So if you play your normal C chord using your little finger or pinky and leave your index or first finger hovering behind the nut of your ukulele like so, and then move the shape up 1 fret, so your first finger is now barring all 4 strings at fret 1 and your pinky is fretting the first string, the one nearest the floor, at the 4th fret, then we have a C sharp or D flat chord. Yes, it can potentially be called either, depending on the key we're playing in, but that explanation is for another lesson. If we then move the whole shape up another fret, maintaining the 3 fret distance between our first finger and pinky, we have a very useful barred version of our D chord. Move it up another fret and we have D sharp or E flat. And finally, if we move it up 1 more fret, so we have our first finger barring all 4 strings at fret 4 and our pinky fretting the first string at the 7th fret, we have this version of E. In this shape we still have the E note on the 3rd string, the G sharp note on the 2nd string, and the B note on the 4th string, the one nearest our face, but this time we have another E note on the 1st string, but it's an octave higher than the E on the 3rd string. So hence we have a slightly different voicing of the same chord with that high E added to the original shape we looked at. I personally think this is a much easier shape to play than the first shape we looked at, but it can be quite a long way to quickly move your hand up the fretboard from our normal open chords, and also a long way back. So I would definitely suggest you still learn and practice both shapes. Also sometimes one is going to sound better than the other in context of the chord sequence you're playing. Another reasonably common E major shape is this one. The way I think of fretting in this is if you play your normal E minor shape, but with fingers 2, 3 and 4 instead of the usual 1st, 2nd and 3rd finger, then take finger 3 off of the fretboard, and lastly add your first finger to the 4th string at the 1st fret, you're left with an E major chord. Here we have the same E note on both the middle strings, a G sharp on the 4th string, and the B on the 1st string nearest the floor. I think this chord rings more than the other 2 shapes because of the open 3rd string and the fact there are 2 E notes ringing in unison in the chord. So now we have 3 options of the full E major chord. I'm sure you will have one shape that you prefer over the others, but it would be good to learn them all. They all have their uses and their own distinct sound. I'm lastly going to show you a couple of 3-string cheat options for the chord. And these are both based on the fact that there are only 3 notes in the chord, but we have 4 strings on our ukuleles. So in the first shape we looked at, if we were to not play one of the B notes on either the 1st string nearest the floor or the 4th string nearest our face, we would still be playing an E chord. Now we can't just leave one of these strings unfretted, otherwise we'll end up with an extra note that shouldn't be in the chord when we strum all 4 strings. But if we were to block or mute one of these strings, just by gently touching it with a finger that is already fretting the adjacent string, we could then strum all 4 strings, but only effectively hear 3 of them sounding a note and 1 muted. This technique is quite common on the guitar where we have more strings than fingers, but can also work just as well on the ukulele. So if the X represents a blocked or muted string, We have a relatively easy option here of playing an E chord, but with the barring finger only sounding the 3 strings nearest our face. But the same finger also needs to be touching the first string nearest the floor, but without pressing it down. Ironically, this will probably be what is happening accidentally when you are first trying to fret the first E chord shape we looked at. Then if I was to pick the strings individually, you would hear strings 4, 3 and 2 ringing, with the notes B, E and G sharp, and a muted first string. But when you strum all 4 strings, you'll hear a full E major chord. I've shown the chord here with our index or pointer finger, barring the 3 strings, but you could equally use your second or third finger as the bar. One more option you could try would be this shape. Here we're fretting the first string at the 2nd fret with our 3rd finger, and the 4th string at the 1st fret with our index or pointer finger. This finger also needs to be touching string 3 enough to mute it, and the 2nd string remains unfretted. If we pick all the strings individually now, you'll hear string 4 sounding a G sharp note, string 3 muted, string 2 sounding an open E, and string 1 sounding a B note. So once again, when we strum all 4 strings, we still hear the 3 notes required to make an E chord. Once again, experiment with all the different options of 4 and 3 string versions and find a shape that works best for you. So one last note before I finish this tutorial. E, or E major, is definitely an awkward chord to play on the ukulele, but a relatively easy and very common chord to play on the guitar. Hence, a lot of songs written on the guitar, and many are, will feature the E major chord. So it's an important chord to learn. I've often heard people say that they've been told by another player at their local ukulele club that you don't need to learn the E chord, just play an E7 instead. Without me heading down a deep rabbit hole on understanding how music works and chord function, this is bad information, and it's not generally okay to substitute E with an E7. If it helps, as a rule of thumb, the only time it is okay to play an E7 chord instead of an E is where it's followed by some form of an A chord. A major, A minor, A7, and so on. So that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I will link this video to a YouTube playlist which will include other chord tip videos as and when I've posted them. If you found this tutorial helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel. As I regularly post new tutorials at all levels, please give the video a thumbs up and feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.